Guy, go ahead.
If I was going to expand on that, you'd have to add experience,
Okay.
knowledge of experience of life.
Going to deal with, as we see there in verse 13, he poses a rhetorical question. Through what James calls their good behavior and their deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. So we've talked about wisdom, but what is understanding? He puts these two together. What does it mean to be wise and understanding? Expounding upon the first question. Okay. Okay. So,
Another example would be, I can understand that a car, I can drive a car, but real understanding the car would have a whole lot more knowledge than that involved. I'd know a whole lot about the inner workings, understanding of how the car works,
okay.
systems in the car, all that kind of thing. Or you could transfer that to any number of things, but it's, yeah, understanding is a pretty wide knowledge.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So anyway, James puts this question out there. He's creating a scenario where someone might make this claim, I am wise and understanding. But James says if someone is going to make this claim, then there's something that's going to be exhibited in how they behave and in the things that they do. That's which come about as a result of what the text calls the gentleness of wisdom. Now, one more question on this verse. He uses the word gentleness. Now, when you're gentle, what does that mean? Guy?
In this particular case, I believe he's talking about empathetic.
Okay, empathetic. That's definitely a part of gentleness. Any other ideas? Okay. Exactly. We're not going to bowl somebody over. And empathy is part of it, but it's the idea of being compassionate as well. So, what he's talking about here is that if they have this claim to be wise and understanding, this person who makes this claim will be gentle in their dealings with others. And that's something we're going to come back to a little later tonight. But with these things being the case, what James says in verse 13 sets the stage for what he'll go on to describe in verses 14 through 18, where James brings to the forefront two kinds of wisdom. And in bringing these things to the forefront, he gives his readers a choice. Which wisdom are you going to employ in your life? More specifically, what James does in verses 14 through 18 is give a description and draws a contrast between what the text will call earthly wisdom and heavenly wisdom. And he's going to give two characteristics of these two kinds of wisdom that we'll see in the text. So he draws a contrast and makes 2 points concerning the two kinds of wisdom described in these verses. The first point, verses 14 through 16, is earthly wisdom. The main point he'll make there is that earthly wisdom is evil. And secondly, in verses 17 and 18, he'll show that heavenly wisdom is pure. So making these points, James gives his readers a choice. Which wisdom will you exhibit in your life? Earthly wisdom or heavenly wisdom? So since that's true, these verses also present us with the same choice. Which one will we pursue? The wisdom of the world or the wisdom of God in the way that we live our lives? So we'll start off by reading in the text, and then we'll look at the points. We've already dealt with verse 13, so we'll start reading at verse 14. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So, again, there's a contrast being drawn between earthly wisdom and heavenly wisdom. James introduces the earthly wisdom part of this, and he says if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, they're a person who has those things not to be arrogant and so lie against the truth. That's what the text says. Now, what is bitter jealousy and selfish ambition? Is there any similarity between those two? Okay, in what way? Okay. Okay, they're mean-spirited. Okay, so yeah, that is a kind of a description of this bitter jealousy and selfish ambition. It's this idea that a person has within themselves a strong sense of jealousy toward others and selfish desires that leads to arrogance because they think they're superior to others. That's what a description of arrogance. But James says that this arrogance that is a result of that bitter jealousy and selfish ambition is something that must not be exhibited, because to do so, James says, is to lie against the truth. Now, with this in mind, what we should also understand here is that lying against the truth is an action where we say or do something that goes against the truth of the gospel. In this case, we lie against the truth when we hold on to these feelings of bitter jealousy, selfish ambition, and exhibit the arrogance that comes with those things. Now, just to draw the contrast, how is exhibiting these feelings lying against the truth of the gospel, that is? Exactly. The truth of the gospel calls us to set these things aside in ourselves.
The whole truth of the gospel is that we're to imitate Christ, or
Right.
Paul, writes about imitating him as he imitates Christ. And what did Christ do? There's a book, I don't remember who wrote the book, but I think it might have been Jimmy McGuigan, but called the God of the Towel or the Lord of the Towel. It's about service
Hmm.
and servitude. And that's what Christ was about servitude. Who's the one who washed the feet? It wasn't Peter, it wasn't James or John or Andrew, it was Jesus who washed their feet. And that's not selfish ambition.
Exactly. So you have meekness in verse 13? Okay. So, okay. Yeah, meekness and gentleness are basically the same thing. Just meekness, a little bit fancier wording for it, but it's still the same thing of gentleness. So, yeah, so if you're being gentle and if you claim to be wise and understanding, you won't have these bitter jealousy and selfish ambition kind of feelings, because that leads to arrogance. The gospel calls us to be just the opposite kind of people. So, having established that point in verse 14, in verse 15, James goes on to say that the things described in verse 14 are an example of a kind of wisdom that does not come down from above, but is instead earthly, natural, demonic. Now, what James writes in this verse has the sense that these things, like bitter jealousy and selfish ambition, along with the arrogance that comes with it, are examples of wisdom that does not have its source in things above. Now, when he's talking about things above, what is he talking about? Heavenly things, things that come from God, we might say. So if they don't come from God, where does it come from? This kind of wisdom. From the devil. And that's part of the reason James says earthly, natural, demonic. He puts these words together. He strings them together. But the point he's making in putting these three words together, he's saying it doesn't have its source in God. It's not spiritual in nature in the way we think of it. Now, one reason we know this is because the word earthly, it's a word that refers to something that is not from God. It's from this world. Then we have the word natural. Now, the word natural is a word that could literally be translated as unspiritual. If something is not spiritual, it's natural. Now, when we talk about something that is natural, what usually comes to mind? Okay, fleshly. Fleshly, earthly. It's physical in nature. So that's what James means by natural. Finally, the word demonic. What does demonic mean? The devil. It's a word associated with the devil and his demons. So putting all these words together, what they have in common is that they're characteristic of a wisdom that James says is not from above, meaning it's a wisdom that does not have its source in God. Questions or comments? Okay. So, having said these things, in verse 16, James goes on to explain why this earthly kind of wisdom does not have its source in God. And he says, where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there's disorder and every evil thing. We've talked about jealousy and selfish ambition, but what is disorder? Chaos, absolutely. Any other ideas? You have confusion? Okay. That's an alternate translation, so it's not bad to have that word there. But what he says in verse 16 summarizes verses 14 and 15. So he says, where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, where they are a reality, that results in disorder and every evil thing. Now, I've mentioned this before, but can anyone remind me what the word evil is about when it comes to the Bible and its relationship with God? Anything against God. So James is saying that where you have this jealousy and selfish ambition, there's disorder / confusion, chaos. But in addition to that, there's also all kinds of things that are opposed to God. Not just one thing, all kinds of things. Now, go ahead.
This passage puts me in mind of the passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 where they're talking of the Lord's Supper and that they all come together, and yet it sounds like chaos
Yeah.
there because they're not unified in what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, that's true in the 1 Corinthians context. There's a lot of jealousy and selfish ambition going on when you read that letter. Exactly. So that's disorder and every evil thing. The chaos and things opposed to God, things that God does not want. God is not a God of chaos. He's definitely not an evil God. So, James is saying all this jealousy and selfish ambition, they get in the way of creating a stable environment. and they get in the way of our being pleasing to God. Now, why does jealousy and selfish ambition get in the way of us being pleasing to God? Guy? Oh, sorry. It's all about self. And Elaine, you had something? Exactly. When you have these feelings of jealousy and selfish ambition, you're putting the focus on yourself instead of on others, and more importantly, on God. And that creates disorder and every evil thing, the instability and the chaos. Questions or comments on verse 16? Interesting. Absolutely. So that's an interesting translation. Anything else on verse 16?
Flexible in some things for ourselves. I've seen people that, if I'll use our 10 o'clock after Bible class, it's 10 o'clock, it's time to start Bible class at 10 o'clock. Never mind if people aren't ready. Never mind if people are socializing a little bit. No, 10 o'clock, you got to start.
Yeah.
So, man, it's not about us. Not about, but it is about us. It's not about me.
It's not about me, right?
I think. It's about what's the benefit of our congregation. And if our congregation is having a social time interacting with each other, that's a great benefit for us. Take a few extra minutes to be a few minutes late getting started. What's the big deal?
Absolutely. Anything else? Okay. So putting verses 14 through 16, James is giving this description of earthly wisdom, and if we were to boil it down to a point, it's that it's evil. Earthly wisdom is opposed to God. So when we're living by that kind of wisdom, we're living in opposition to God. Now, one reason for this is because to exercise earthly wisdom is to put the focus on ourselves rather than on others and on God. Now, according to James, exercising this kind of wisdom ultimately results in disorder and every evil thing. Because of these attitudes of jealousy and selfish ambition, they create instability and lives that are in opposition to God. So that brings us into verses 17 and 18, where James now flips the coin. He gets into heavenly wisdom, and the point he'll make here is that it's pure. Now, this point is introduced with James saying, he calls it the wisdom from above, and he's going to make the point here in verse 17 that it's of a completely different nature than that the wisdom of the wisdom which is not from above. Now, we've already asked this question somewhat, but what does it mean when something is from above? It's from God. That's the idea here. This wisdom that he's about to describe is from God. And as we see there in the verse, he gives several characteristics of this wisdom. The first one being pure. Now, when something is pure, what does that mean? It's clean. It's free from any kind of stain. In this context, it's free from sin. So he's giving the idea here that the person who has this kind of wisdom is living their lives in a way that is pleasing to God. It's pure. Nothing wrong with it in the eyes of God. As a result, the second characteristic is that it's peaceable. Now, when something is peaceable, what does that mean? Without conflict is a good way to describe it. In other words, it's the idea is that it promotes peace. Heavenly wisdom promotes peace. Now, drawing a bit of a contrast, earthly wisdom, James has said, creates disorder and every evil thing. But heavenly wisdom creates just the opposite, creates peace. Now, one reason we can say this is because being peaceable means you are seeking to create a stable environment, is one way to put it, as opposed to this unstable environment. Questions or comments before we go to the next characteristic? All right, next, gentle, a word we've already touched on. Now, I'll ask this question again. What does it mean when you are being gentle towards someone? Taking great care. And somebody said something over here. Empathizing, that was said. So that's all true. Another way to define the word gentle is you're not being quick to react. In other words, someone does something and instead of reacting right away, you take a step back. Now, gentle builds on peaceable because gentleness also promotes peace. Where else in the Bible do we see gentleness? Outside of James. The fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and then gentleness. So it's a big part of how we're supposed to be. So this person who is gentle does not immediately react, but instead exercises patience in the interest of keeping peace. In my relationship with my daughter, this is something I struggle with because I see she does something wrong and I want to react immediately, and I'll admit sometimes I do. But thankfully I have a wife who encourages me, be gentle. Don't be so quick to react. That's what gentleness is. Next, the fourth characteristic James gives of this wisdom from above is that it's reasonable. Now, what does it mean to be reasonable? Willing to hear and consider it. Now, what's another word for that in that context? Willing to yield, okay. It's the idea of being open-minded is what this word reasonable or willing to yield. It is that idea of being willing to listen to the other side. Now, as this ties in as a characteristic of the wisdom from above, it's a characteristic that has to do with being open to the views of other people. In our circles, there will be things on which we disagree. It's just the nature of the beast. But if we're reasonable, we'll take those disagreements and seek out truth in the midst of those disagreements. That's being reasonable. It's exercising the wisdom from above. Questions or comments on that? Okay. Characteristic number 5, these two phrases together. The wisdom from above is full of mercy and good fruits. Now, what is mercy? Okay, forgiveness is a part of mercy. Any other ideas? Okay. Now, forgiveness is a part of it, but mercy more specifically refers to compassion, is the best way to describe it. But James says that the wisdom from above is full of mercy and good fruits. Now, can anyone remind me what the word fruit is about in the Bible? Like the fruit of the Spirit, for instance. Things that are produced. That's what the word fruit primarily has to do with. In this case, having the wisdom from above, it produces good things. Why? Because it's full of mercy. So that brings us into the next characteristic. But any questions on mercy and good fruits? Okay. Characteristic number 6, the wisdom from above is unwavering. Now, what does it mean to be unwavering? Steady and firm. You're not going back and forth. Now, the actual word that James uses here in the original language, it's found only here in the New Testament. And it's a word that literally means undivided. It's steadiness. Now, as James is using it here, he refers to the fact that someone is undivided in their commitment to God and to others. An example of this kind of person would be someone who keeps their word. They say they're going to do something, they do it. They are undivided. They're unwavering, James would say. That brings us into the next characteristic, without hypocrisy. Now, what does the word hypocrisy mean? It's a word we throw around a lot. Say one thing and do another. That's one way to define hypocrisy. It's also the idea of not putting on an act. Now, in the original language, this word hypocrisy or hypocrite, it referred to an actor, like we see on the movies and stuff. It's someone who pretends to be something that they're not. So, as James is using it here, this refers to the fact that a person who has the wisdom of above will be genuine in their dealings with others. They won't just put on an act and pretend to be something they're not. Now, as this builds on unwavering, it means you're committed to living your life in a way that is pleasing to God. You've made that commitment to God, you're going to keep it at all costs. So that covers verse 17. Any questions or comments on verse 17? Okay. So having given a description of the wisdom from above in verse 18, James goes on to describe a result of exercising that wisdom, which is that the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Now, when we think of a seed, what comes to mind? What does a seed do? It grows. It sprouts. So James is using that imagery to talk about what the seed of a person who exercises wisdom from above produces. According to this verse, what is produced by the seed of the person who exercises wisdom from above? What's the fruit? Righteousness. A harvest of righteousness, translation might say. Can anyone tell me what the word righteousness means? Being right with God. Even more simply than that, the word just means right. The word is in the word. So, what James says here carries with it the idea that if a person exhibits the characteristics of wisdom from above, the result of that is that they will plant a seed that produces righteousness, and this is a seed that is sown in peace. Now, what does it mean that this seed is sown in peace? Okay. So, yeah. Exactly. It's done in a way that's calm and right, that doesn't create conflict. Now, based on the last part of the verse, who's sowing this particular seed? What does the text say? Those who make peace. Now, what would Jesus call these people over in the Beatitudes discussion? Peacemakers. So this refers to the fact, applied here, what James says refers to the fact that if a person is exercising this wisdom from above, and the characteristics that come with it, and the result is that this person is planting a seed that results in being in a right relationship with God. Why? Because it's a seed that promotes peace in the lives of those who make peace by continuing to sow this seed. Now, with all that in mind, the peace that James seems to have in mind here is the peace that we have with God when we make a choice to exercise his wisdom in the way that we live our lives. Questions or comments on verse 18? Okay. So, putting verses 17 and 18 together, the description of heavenly wisdom that is given here, if we were to boil it down, it's that it's pure. James has shown that heavenly wisdom is something that is not stained by sin. And that results in the fact that it's a wisdom that is pleasing to God. When you live your life in this way, exercise these characteristics, you're being pleasing to God. And that's because it's a wisdom that is made up of characteristics that promote peace. They promote peace with God, and they promote peace with others. As a result, this wisdom is a seed. It's a seed that produces righteousness, being in that right relationship with God. But the condition of that is that this seed has to be sown in a peaceful manner by those who are seeking to be peacemakers, Jesus might say. So when we consider what James has said in verses 13 through 18 of this chapter, the point we should be left with is that if we're going to claim to be wise and understanding, then this is demonstrated in the way that we live our lives. Why? One reason is because earthly wisdom is evil. Secondly, heavenly wisdom is pure. So what we should learn from these verses is that we must exercise the right kind of wisdom. There's all kinds of wisdom out there, but there's only one right kind of wisdom. So we have a choice: the wisdom of the world or the wisdom of God, which comes down from above. We have to decide what kind of wisdom we're going to employ. If we choose to employ earthly wisdom, James says, this will create instability in our lives, and we'll be living in opposition to God. But on the other hand, if we employ heavenly wisdom, then we'll have more peaceful lives. Not that our lives will be easy, but they'll be more peaceful. And that peace is a product of us being in a right relationship with God, because we've chosen to plant a seed that results in righteousness, when that seed is planted in a peaceful manner by those who promote peace. So again, we're left with a choice: earthly wisdom or heavenly wisdom. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Dean, will you close us in prayer today? Cool. That's rough. Oh, sorry to hear that. Did everyone get that, or do I need to mic it? But we'll keep both those situations in prayer. Sandy, let your job interview go well, and your parents might make a quick recovery.
Who's your job interview with?
County Commissioner Rose.
Wow.
Fine.
So is that like to be secretary or
Cook.
a cook? Okay. Cool.
For the county? Oh, that's a big job.
For the Senior Citizen Center.
Cool.
Oh, good. It's on Wilson. That's a beautiful building. It's really nice. It's huge.
It is, it is.
I definitely
And I think
recommend
they
it.
really, that they have a lot of business. There's a lot of people that come.
Maria took me to eat there a couple weeks ago, just to see it.
Yeah.
Good opportunity.
You wanna go see
sure do. Yes, you do. I have it. Yes, I'd like for you to have that back.
Todd found that the other day.
Well, you probably miss
Then
it.
I